Elias Thorne stood on the porch, his calloused hands idling over the worn grip of his Colt 45. He wasn't looking at the desert. His eyes were locked on three riders pulling up just short of the rail fence. They were bounty hunters out of Dust Creek, carrying the stench of cheap gunpowder, and the kind of greed that's written all over a man's face through layers of trail dust. Thorne, we ain't looking for no trouble. The leader spoke up, a man named Miller with a scar cutting right through his eyebrow. He spat a dark glob of tobacco juice onto the parched earth. But this patch of dirt sits right on the mouth of the North Silver Vein. Mr. Vane's put a real handsome price on it. Don't go making us do this the hard way. Elias didn't budge. At 40, his frame was like a weathered old oak lean, but solid as a rock. His gray eyes were as calm as a frozen lake, the look of a man who'd seen enough death in the Civil War to not give a damn about much else. My land ain't for sale. Elias's voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. And Miller, you take one more step across that line, and I won't call it trouble. I'll call it legit self-defense. Miller gripped the reins, a mean glint in his eyes, as his hand strayed near his holster. Right then, a strange sound drifted from the trail leading up the canyon. It wasn't the rhythmic pounding of hooves, but the dry crunch of tired, dragging footsteps on the gravel. Both Elias and the bounty hunters turned their heads. Out of the hazy curtain of a rising death storm, a small silhouette emerged. Then two, then three, finally five. Leading them was a black teenager. He wore a tattered shirt and leather boots, so worn his toes peeked through, caked in red dust. The boy's face was dark and slick with sweat, his lips cracked and bleeding, but his eyes burned with a cold-blooded resolve that could give a man the chills. In his left arm he carried a small child, maybe 5 years old, who looked half dead. His right hand tightly gripped the hand of another young girl. Two more children followed close behind, huddling against their brother's ragged clothes like scared pups looking for cover in a storm. The bounty hunters burst out laughing. Well, look at that, Thorne, a flock of stray blackbirds. Looks like your ranch is turning into a poorhouse. Caleb Montgomery didn't spare the men on horseback a glance. He looked straight at Elias Thorne. He had spent 3 days trekking across the desert, pushing through raw fear and gut-wrenching hunger just to find this man. He stopped 10 paces from Elias, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his back stayed straight. You Elias Thorne? Caleb asked. His voice was raspy but clear. Elias narrowed his eyes and gave a sharp nod. That's right. Caleb set the youngest sibling down on the withered grass. From the pocket of his sweat-soaked shirt, he pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, folded over and over. He stepped forward and laid it on the fence post in front of Elias. My father was Silas Montgomery. He said if the world ever went to hell, I was to find Ridge Canyon, Caleb said, his eyes never flickering despite Miller's gun or Elias' cold stare. He said you owed him a life, and today I've come to collect on that debt. Miller scoffed, drawing his iron to intimidate the boy. Listen here, kid. You got any idea who you're talking to? Get lost before a flash of fire. The round from Elias' Colt slammed into the wood right by Miller's horse hoof, making the animal bolt and rear up. No one had even seen him draw. Clear out, Elias said, his voice now carrying the weight of a death warrant. Before I adjust my aim, Miller's crew looked into Elias's eyes, then at the smoking barrel, and realized this cowboy wasn't just blowing smoke. Miller hissed through his teeth, jerking the reins to turn his horse. This ain't over, Thorne. Vane won't let this slide. And those brats, they're going to be the death of you. As the sound of hooves faded, the air returned to the dead silence of the desert. Elias holstered his piece and stepped down the stone stairs. He picked up the paper. It was a will scribbled on old military orders, the handwriting of Silas Montgomery, a soldier of the 54th Infantry who had carried Elias off the field at Gettysburg under a hail of lead. Elias looked down at Caleb. The boy had started to shake. His legs finally gave out. Where's your father? Elias asked, though he already knew. They killed him at the border, Caleb answered, his voice thick, but he forced himself to swallow his tears. They wanted the deed. Pa gave it to me and told me to run. I ran, 14 miles. Late, Elias looked over the other 4 children. The youngest, Henry, was on the ground having a fever dream. The twin girls, Sarah and Ruth, were clinging to each other, looking at Elias with wide, terrified eyes like he was the hanging judge. The 12-year-old boy, James, was trying to shield his siblings with his scrawny frame. Caleb knelt beside Henry, pulling out a tin canteen that had run dry. He tried shaking it, hoping for one last drop. When nothing came, he put the canteen to his own mouth, then lowered it, looking up at Elias with a pleading but proud as hell gaze. "Please," Caleb whispered, "don't worry about me. Save my brother. He's only 5. He didn't do nothing wrong." In that moment, Elias Thorne felt something that had been dead a long time start to stir in his chest. He'd spent 6 years running from the world, running from the screams of the battlefield, choosing the life of a loner so he wouldn't be on the hook for anyone's life. But here were 5 little souls laid bare before him, in a land where even the cacti have teeth. Elias didn't say a word. He stepped forward and scooped Henry up. The boy was burning up like a hot coal. "James, get the bags inside. You 2 girls follow me," Elias ordered. "Caleb, get up. If you die on my porch, I won't know how to explain it to your father when I see him on the other side." Caleb tried to stand, but the world started spinning. He saw Elias' tall shadow heading into the house and saw his siblings being led to safety. A wave of relief washed over him, taking the last bit of strength, keeping him upright. Caleb Montgomery collapsed onto the red dirt right at the foot of the stairs. Before the darkness took him, he caught a glimpse of Elias Thorne turning back, the cowboy's large hands reaching out for him. Inside the cabin, Elias laid Henry on the bed and started pouring water into a copper basin. He worked mechanically, but carefully. He took clean strips of cloth, soaked them in cool water, and laid them on the boy's forehead and underarms. James and the girls huddled in the corner, their eyes never leaving Elias. They had never seen a white man act this way. Out there they were targets, property, or trash. But here this man was tending to their brother with a quiet respect. Elias brought out a loaf of cornbread and some beef jerky. "Eat," he said shortly. The kids looked at the plate like it was a goddamn miracle. They ate with the desperation of those who had been staring death in the face. Elias watched them, then looked out the window. The dust storm had arrived, swallowing the canyons and turning the world into a murky red. He stepped onto the porch and carried the unconscious Caleb inside. Laying the teenager on the rug by the hearth, Elias studied the boy's face. "Caleb Montgomery, you got the face of a warrior," Elias thought. "And you just brought a war to my front door." Silas Vane wasn't a man who folded easy. He was the kind who used the law as a blade and money as a shield. Elias knew Miller would head back to Dust Creek and report the presence of 5 black children. In a Western society still thick with racial hatred, a white cowboy taking in 5 black kids wasn't just a curiosity. It was a sore thumb to the powerful. Elias sat in his old armchair and lit his pipe. Pale blue smoke curled in the dim cabin. He pulled out Silas Montgomery's will to read it again. On the back of the paper was a crude, hand-drawn map of the property lines in Bitterroot Valley. Elias narrowed his eyes. He recognized the small geological marks. This wasn't just farmland. It was the silver vein, the very thing Silas Vane was willing to kill for. "The law," Elias muttered. "He'll use the law to strip 'em bare." He looked over at Caleb. The boy had started to stir, his breathing steadying. Elias knew that by morning, when the dust settled, the cold, hard truth would come knocking again. He wasn't a free agent anymore. He had chosen to stand guard over a treasure he hadn't even fully realized was this damn dangerous. The dawn cracked through the red rock canyons, bringing that bone-chilling high desert cold before the sun could return to bake the earth. Elias Thorne blew out the oil lamp as the wick sputtered dry, his joints popping like dry kindling as he stood up from his armchair. Caleb had been awake since midnight, sitting with his back against the timber wall. His eyes were heavy with dark circles, but sharp as a tack, watching Elias's every move with the wariness of a small animal that had dodged one too many traps. "Henry's pulled through the worst of it," Elias said, his voice raspy from lack of sleep, nodding toward the boy sleeping soundly under a wool blanket. "But our troubles are just getting started." Caleb looked down at his rough hands, where the grit-cut scratches had begun to scab over. "Miller coming back. He ain't just coming back. I'll be carrying a warrant or some paper with a court seal on it. Elias stepped toward the wooden table where Silas Montgomery's map still lay. In Dust Creek, Silas Vane don't use a gun to steal land. He uses the law. He's a lawyer, Caleb. He knows how to turn an honest man into a criminal with nothing but a few lines of ink and a fancy stamp. Caleb stood up, wobbling for a second before finding his footing. Pa said you were the squarest man he ever knew. That's why he sent us. Elias paused, a faint ghost of a smile touching his weathered face. Justice is a high-priced luxury out here in the West, kid. Sometimes it costs blood to buy it. Less than 3 hours later, Elias's gut feeling turned into plain fact. The rhythmic drumming of hooves echoed up the only trail into the ranch. This time, it wasn't just 3 bounty hunters. Leading the pack was the local sheriff, Grady, a pot-bellied man with a silver star pinned to his chest that caught the sun, riding alongside Silas Vane. Vane didn't look like a killer. He wore a fine wool suit and a silk-string tie, riding a white horse so clean it looked out of place in this godforsaken dust. He had a smooth face and a permanent smile, the kind of grin that made Elias think of a rattlesnake about to strike. Elias stepped out onto the porch. His Colt stayed in leather, but his fingers hovered near the grip. Caleb and James stood by the window inside, watching in silence. "Thorn!" Grady hollered, reining in 10 yards from the porch. "I got a complaint here from Mr. West," and the mayor moved forward. "Vane, you are holding 5 minors against the law. Mr. Vane here is their only kin and has legal guardianship." "Kin?" Elias arched an eyebrow, looking straight at Vane. "I don't see much family resemblance between a slick lawyer and some poor kids who had to trek 14 miles to outrun the hired guns you put on them." Vane spoke up, his voice smooth as honey, but cold as a January frost. "Blood is blood, Mr. Thorne. Caleb's father, Silas, was a distant cousin of mine. I have the papers to prove it. Keeping them out here in the middle of nowhere without a doctor or proper security is neglect. Under Arizona territorial law, I have the right to take them back to Dust Creek for their own good, or just to get their thumbprints on a deed for that silver vein in Bitterroot." Elias fired back. The smile on Vane's face twitched for a split second before he regained his cool. He turned to Grady. "Sheriff, you see, Thorne is obstructing justice and clearly delusional. Do your job." Grady dismounted, hand on his holster, and started toward the steps. "Step aside, Thorne. Don't make this ugly. You know I don't want to pull iron on a veteran." "Grady, you set foot on these stairs without a legal search warrant, and you're trespassing," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave but carrying. "Under Section 4, Clause 2 of the Territorial Code, a man's got the right to defend his home against any unauthorized entry without a judge's signature. You got that paper on you?" Grady froze. He cut a look at Vane. Vane gnashed his teeth and whispered something. It was clear they hadn't had time to forge or fetch a formal warrant that fast. They'd hoped the sheriff's badge would be enough to buffalo the old cowboy. "We'll be back with that warrant," Vane said, spurring his horse forward a step. "And when we do, Thorne, not only are the kids coming with us, but you're going to rot in a cell for kidnapping. I'll make sure you waste away in the state pen." The group wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust. Elias stood on the porch until they disappeared behind the canyon. He turned inside to find Caleb standing there, his knuckles white from clenching his fists. "We can't wait for him to come back," Elias said. "James, help your sisters pack the essentials. Caleb, come to the barn." Inside the barn, smelling of hay and old leather, Elias pulled a wooden chest from under a pile of straw. Inside was a stack of old books and legal papers he'd studied during his years in hiding. He handed Caleb a small black leather-bound book. "This is the Arizona Territorial Code," Elias said, dead serious. "He's using the law as a weapon. We gotta fight fire with fire. From here to Dust Creek, you're gonna memorize every part I've marked about guardianship and inheritance. You ain't just a runaway kid anymore, Caleb. You're gonna be your siblings' legal shield in a court of law." Caleb took the book, his fingers trembling as they brushed the thin pages. "Can I really do this? They won't listen to a kid like me. They'll have to listen if you speak their language. The law is the only thing men like Vane fear when it's handled right. Elias said while throwing a saddle on his horse. We're heading back to your father's old place in Bitterroot. Why? It's all burned down, Caleb said, stunned. We need the original survey of that silver mine and the formal will. What you got is just a hurried copy, Elias explained, his eyes sparking with a sharp intensity. Bain wants that land for the silver, but he can only mine it if he has the legal title. If the original is still in that wall safe your father mentioned, we've got our ace in the hole. The ride through the red rock canyons was a tense, silent affair. The 5 children were split between 2 pack horses, with Caleb riding double behind Elias on a dark stallion. The sun hit its peak, baking the air until the rocks seemed to shimmer in the heat. As they neared Bitterroot, black smoke from the ruins still seemed to linger in the air. The Montgomery house was nothing but charred, gray timber standing like skeletons in a field of dead grass. Caleb slid off the horse, his shoulders shaking as he looked at what used to be his home, now nothing but a graveyard of ash. Don't let the grief blind you, Elias warned, sliding his Winchester rifle out of its scabbard. Keep your eyes peeled. Vane ain't stupid. He might have left someone behind. Sure enough, as they stepped into the courtyard of the ruined house, a shot rang out from the old barn. The bullet grazed Elias' shoulder and splintered a charred post. Get down, Elias barked, shoving Caleb behind a stone wall. Miller and 2 other bounty hunters stepped out from the wreckage, guns leveled. Knew you'd come back sniffing around for something, Miller sneered, the scar on his face twitching. No Sheriff Grady to hold me back this time, Thorne. Elias leaned out from the wall and his Winchester roared. One of Miller's goons went down clutching a leg. The gunfight was a nail-biter, echoing between the scorched walls as dust and ash kicked up with every round. Caleb, get behind the hearth, Elias yelled over the crack of gunfire. Find that safe. I'll keep 'em pinned. Caleb crawled through the hot ash, his heart hammering against his ribs. He remembered his father's words, under the 3rd brick to the right of the fireplace. He dug into the rubble with his bare hands. His nails bled, but the fear for his siblings waiting in the distance gave him nerves of steel. A shot slammed into the wall just above his head, raining debris down on him. Miller was closing in, his 6-shooter raised high. Elias was pinned down behind a stone wall by the other goon's fire. Got it, Caleb shouted as his fingers hit a cold iron ring buried under the dirt. He pulled with everything he had. A small compartment popped open, revealing a shiny tin tube untouched by the fire. Right then, Miller stepped over the rubble, the black bore of his gun pointed straight at Caleb's chest. Hand it over, boy, he growled. Caleb looked at the barrel, then down at the tin tube. His siblings' entire future was in his hands. He didn't hand it over. Instead, he spotted an old iron wolf trap buried under the ash right by Miller's boot, something he and James had set the week before to keep predators away. Not a chance, Caleb whispered. He threw a handful of hot ash right into Miller's eyes. Miller recoiled by instinct, taking a step back. Clack! The sound of cold steel snapping shut echoed through the ruins. Miller let out a blood-curdling scream as the iron teeth of the wolf trap bit deep into his ankle. His gun went off wild into the sky. Taking the opening, Elias lunged forward and brought the butt of his rifle down on Miller's head, knocking him cold. Seeing their leader down, the remaining goon panicked, hopped on his horse, and rode off like a bat out of hell into the canyon. Elias panted, looking at the blood on his shoulder, and then at Caleb, who was clutching the tin tube to his chest, covered in soot, but with eyes like fire. He walked over and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. You did good, Caleb. Real brave, Elias said, his voice filled with genuine respect. Pa died to keep this, Caleb said, his voice thick as he opened the tube. Inside was a notarized will and a detailed geological survey bearing the seal of the Federal Land Office. He knew Vane was coming. He set it all up so we'd have a fighting chance. Elias took the will, reading every line under the fading afternoon sun. His face turned grim. This ain't just a will. It's an indictment. He flipped to the back page, where Silas Montgomery had logged months of threats and plots from Vane leading up to the fire. Silas had recorded everything like a soldier's war journal. We got proof of the silver, and we got proof of Vane's crimes, Elias said, rolling the paper back up. But Miller's gonna wake up. and Vane's gonna know we're holding the very thing that can put his neck in a noose. Elias looked toward Dust Creek, where the faint lights were starting to flicker on the horizon. He knew the path back to the Lone Wolf Ranch was cut off. They'd have the place surrounded by nightfall. The only choice now was to walk straight into the lion's den. We're hitting Dust Creek tonight, Elias decided. We're gonna find the circuit judge before Vane can grease his palms. James, Sarah, Ruth, Henry, listen up. It's gonna be a long night, but I promise you when the sun comes up, no one's gonna touch a hair on your heads ever again. Flickering oil lamps cast long shadows from the windows of the saloons and boarding houses, where the sound of a tinny piano clashed with the raucous laughter of miners who just struck it rich at the tables. Elias signaled the group to halt at the edge of the pine woods, where the darkness was thickest, to scout the terrain. Judge Miller's office is right next to the post office, Elias whispered, his eyes locked on the main strip. But look at that. Grady ain't sleeping. Two of the sheriff's deputies were pacing in front of the courthouse, rifles slung over their shoulders. It was plain as day that Silas Vane had anticipated Elias looking for a day in court. He'd turned the town's law enforcement into his own private goon squad. We can't just storm the place with 5 kids in tow, Caleb said. His voice trembled from the midnight chill, but his eyes were unnervingly sharp. We need another way in. There's a root cellar tunnel running from the general store to the back of the courthouse, Elias recalled from his days hauling military freight. But that store's going to be locked up tighter than a drum. Caleb looked down at his small hands, then at James. James can squeeze through the transom above the back door. He's small and quick. Once he's inside, he can bolt the door for us. James nodded, his 12-year-old face set with a dead-set grit. Elias looked at the Montgomery brothers, feeling the bold blood of Silas the soldier pumping through their veins. It didn't stop them. In the West, survival sometimes meant betting the farm on the youngest among them. The break-in went off in total silence. James slipped through the narrow transom like a ghost, and a few minutes later, the wooden latch clicked. Elias led the children into the general store, the smell of leather, flour, and kerosene wrapping around them. They navigated the aisles, headed down into the damp root cellar, and crawled through the narrow, cobweb-filled passage leading straight to the courthouse basement. When they emerged through the trap door in the clerk's office, Elias immediately pressed against the main door, listening. The building was quiet, save for the steady, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. Judge Miller ain't here, Caleb said, his heart sinking as he saw the empty chair behind the main desk. He lives in the brick house behind the church, Elias said. But we don't need him just yet. We need the seal and the ledger. Right then, a flashlight beam swept across the window. Elias yanked Caleb under the desk just as the sound of a key turning in the front lock echoed through the hall. It wasn't Judge Miller. Silas Vane walked in, followed by Sheriff Grady. Vane looked fit to be tied, his long duster coat caked in trail dust. I don't give a damn where Miller is, Vane snapped at Grady. Use your authority and open that land safe. I need to deep six the old Bitterroot survey before Thorne shows up with that damn original. If he gets federal confirmation, that silver mine is gone for good. But Mr. Vane, messing with land records is a federal rap, Grady hedged, his voice shaking with clear-cut yellow streaks. I'm the law in this town, Grady. Vane slammed his hand on the desk, the sound booming in the empty room. Why do you think you're wearing that tin star? Because you're a crack shot. No, because I bankrolled your campaign. Now get to it. Huddled under the desk, Caleb's heart was hammering against his ribs. He looked at Elias, who was slowly drawing his Colt, but Caleb placed a hand on his arm, signaling him to hold his fire. He whispered in Elias's ear, "Don't shoot. We need this confession." Caleb pulled a small notebook and a pencil stub from his shirt pocket, things he'd swiped from the office desk. With intense focus, he began scribbling down every word out of Vane and Grady's mouths, noting the time and the place. He knew a cowboy shooting a sheriff would be branded an outlaw, but a blow-by-blow account from a witness alongside official docs would be a legal weapon they couldn't ignore. The safe let out a dry screech as Grady turned the dial. Vane snatched up the files, flipping through them like a madman. Here it is. Bitterroot Lot 42. Give me that light. He pulled a sheet out and struck a match. The small flame flared up, casting a yellow glow on the lawyer's greedy, crooked face. Hold it right there, in the name of the law. The voice wasn't Elias's, but a gravelly, commanding boom from the stairs leading to the second floor. Judge Miller stepped down carrying an oil lamp and a double-barreled shotgun. Turns out he'd been sleeping in his chambers to prep for the morning's docket. Vane froze, the match burning down to his fingers until he dropped the paper onto the stone floor. Judge, we were just checking the security after that mess at Thorne's place. Checking security by burning records, Silas. Miller narrowed his eyes at the scorched paper on the floor. I've heard enough. Grady, holster that iron right now. Elias finally stood up from his hiding spot, his gun leveled at Vane. Caleb and James stepped out too, Caleb holding up his notebook. Judge, this here is a record of Mr. Vane's plot to destroy evidence, Caleb said, his voice ringing out clear as a bell. And this, he opened the tin tube, pulling out the original will and the federal survey, is why he wanted to burn this room down. Judge Miller took the papers, inspecting the federal seal with a practiced eye. Vane went pale as a sheep, backing away, his eyes darting for a bolt hole. Silas Vane, you're disbarred and under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, destruction of public records, and attempted land grabbing, Miller declared. Grady, if you've got an ounce of honor left in that badge, cuff him. If not, you're the next one in irons. Grady, being a spineless man who only followed the money, immediately turned on Vane. Sorry, Mr. Vane, I can't go against the judge. But Vane wasn't one to take it lying down. He suddenly whipped a small hideaway gun from his sleeve, aiming right at Caleb, his most dangerous living witness. Elias's round caught Vane in the wrist before he could squeeze the trigger. The pocket pistol clattered onto the floor. Vane slumped down, clutching his bloody wrist and screaming blue murder. Get him to the lockup, Miller ordered his deputies as they burst in. And put Grady in a cell too. I'll be taking statements personally tonight. The room went quiet again. Judge Miller looked at the 5 children, then at Elias Thorne. He sighed, placing a weathered hand on Caleb's shoulder. Son, you did something most grown men in this town wouldn't have the stomach for. You used your head and the truth to stare down the devil. I just did what my pa and Mr. Elias taught me, Caleb replied, humble-like. Thorne. Miller turned to Elias. This guardianship battle is going to be a long haul in circuit court next week. Vane's got a lot of cronies and state-level pull. He won't stay behind bars for long. I know, Elias said, wiping the bore of his gun, his gray eyes looking out the window, where the dawn was finally breaking the night's back. That's why we ain't staying in Dust Creek. I need to get these kids somewhere where the voice of justice ain't drowned out by the sound of falling gold. Where you headed? Miller asked. Phoenix, Elias answered firmly. The federal district court. That's where Silas Montgomery's Bitterroot records get filed, without some shyster messing with them. Early that morning, Dust Creek was buzzing with the news that the biggest lawyer in the territory was in the hoosgow. In the middle of the stir, an old wagon quietly pulled out of town, heading south. Caleb sat in the back, holding his siblings close. Henry's fever had broken, and he was sleeping soundly in Sarah's lap. James was flipping through Elias's law book, muttering clauses about justice under his breath. Elias held the reins, his broad back shielding the group from the early morning grit. He wasn't just a retired cavalryman looking for a quiet life anymore. He was escorting a future legacy, written in blood and truth. Caleb, Elias called out without turning around. Sir, Mr. Elias. Long, you know why the law matters? Caleb thought on it for a second. Because it gives the little guy a say against the big shots. Right, but that ain't the whole of it, Elias said, his voice warmer than it had ever been. The law is like a trail through the desert. Without it, we're just lost to our own instincts. You chose to walk that trail tonight, and you saved your family, not with a gun, but by getting it all down in black and white. After the fallout at the Dust Creek courthouse, the air grew thick with a wary silence. Elias didn't push the horses too hard. He knew the Arizona desert was a patient butcher to kill any man who ran his mounts ragged before they ever caught sight of the city lights. We're being followed, ain't we, Uncle? Caleb spoke up, cutting through the steady crunch of the wagon wheels. He didn't turn around, but his ears had grown sharp after those long days on the run. Elias narrowed his eyes under the brim of the Stetson, catching a reflection in the small mirror hitched to the side of the wagon. Vane's behind bars, but his money ain't. Men like Miller don't work for loyalty. They work for the gold coins they've been promised. We took away their legal hand, so now all they got left is gunpowder. They made camp at a derelict way station near Whitebone Canyon just as the sun began casting its ruthless, long shadows across the dirt. Elias ordered the kids to stay put in the wagon while he stepped down, hand hovering near his holster, circling the perimeter. The station was nothing more than rotting timber walls and a well that had gone bone dry years ago. James helped me stack these sandbags around the axles. You little ones, hunker down on the floorboards, and don't you dare look up, no matter what you hear, Elias barked with the tone of a battlefield commander. Right then, from a cluster of giant saguaros about 200 yards out, a glint of metal flashed. A rifle round tore through the air, slamming into the wagon frame just inches from Caleb's head. Elias lunged instantly, tackling Caleb to the ground and shoving him behind a large boulder near the well. Sniper, Elias bellowed. They got at least 2 shooters to the northwest. The ambush was savage. Miller, the bounty hunter with a scarred face, had managed to escape the wolf trap and was now hell-bent on revenge. He and his crew weren't looking to take anyone alive anymore. They wanted to wipe out every shred of evidence, along with the last of the witnesses. The Winchester fire was deafening, echoing off the canyon walls like claps of thunder. Elias pressed his body into the hot sand, his Colt spitting lead in steady intervals to keep them pinned. But he knew he was behind the 8 ball. Ammo was running low, and he was trying to shield 5 kids in the middle of a shooting gallery. Caleb, Elias yelled over the whistle of bullets. Look at that old drainage ditch to your right. It runs deep and goes straight out the back of the canyon. You gotta lead your siblings through there. I'll draw their fire. No, Uncle Elias. You'll get killed, Caleb screamed, tears streaking through the red dust on his face. Listen here. Elias turned and looked the boy dead in the eye, his gray gaze burning with absolute conviction. You've got that tin tube and the notebook. Those are weapons more powerful than any gun I'm packing. If I go down, you keep running for Phoenix. Find the federal circuit judge. Promise me you won't let your father's legacy get buried in the sand. Caleb looked at Elias, then at James and the 3 little ones trembling in the wagon. He realized Elias's sacrifice was their only fighting chance. He nodded a nod that carried the weight of a grown man. Caleb gave a sharp whistle to James. The 2 brothers moved like clockwork, dragging Henry, Sarah, and Ruth down into the ditch. Elias bolted upright, emptying 6 rounds toward the cacti, shouting at the top of his lungs to lead Miller astray. Thorn, where you running now? Miller's voice echoed, crazed with bloodlust. Caleb saw Elias's back disappear behind a hail of lead. He gritted his teeth, leading his siblings as they crawled to a ditch filled with thorns and jagged rocks. Every inch they covered was bought with sweat and pain. But the promise he made to Elias kept Caleb's legs from buckling under him. When they finally broke out of the canyon and found the shortcut through the pine woods, Caleb stopped. He looked back at the station where gun smoke was still drifting. He wanted to run back, but Henry's soft whimper reminded him of his duty. He pulled out Elias's law book, flipping to the bookmark page, Federal Court, Supreme Guardianship. We keep moving, Caleb said, the tremor finally gone from his voice. We're making it to Phoenix. The 3-day trek that followed was a trial of pure will. They walked through the night to dodge the heat and the bounty hunters' scouts. Caleb taught the young ones how to cover their tracks, how to pull water from succulent trees, and how to stay quiet as a grave whenever they heard distant hooves. Finally, on the afternoon of the 4th day, the red brick buildings and paved streets of Phoenix appeared under a golden sunset. Arizona's biggest city greeted them with a mix of hustle and cold indifference. Caleb, in his tattered clothes and soot-stained face, led the pack into the grand federal courthouse. We need to see the federal judge, Caleb told the clerk, who was looking at them like they were something the cat dragged in. Kid, this ain't no place for strays. Beat it before I call the law, the clerk waved him off. Caleb didn't flinch. He pulled the tin tube out and slammed it onto the marble desk. I am Caleb Montgomery, legal heir to the Bitterroot Silver Vein. I have evidence of a murder plot and bribery by attorney Silas Vane, and I got a handwritten log of his confession. The clerk froze when he saw the federal seal on the tube. A moment later, a middle-aged man with silver hair and gold-rimmed spectacles stepped out from the back office. It was federal Judge Harrison, a man known for being straight as an arrow and hell on anyone who twisted the law. "Step inside, young man," Harrison said, his voice low and steady. In an office smelling of old books and oak, Caleb laid it all out. He didn't miss a single beat, from the night his father was murdered to Elias Thorne's stand at the way station. He placed the notebook and the will on the desk. Judge Harrison read every line, his brow furrowed. Silas Vane has stretched his tentacles too far, but he made a fatal mistake. He thought the law was a toy. He didn't reckon on a 14-year-old boy using it as a shield for justice. "Your Honor," Caleb choked out, "Uncle Elias. He gave his life for us. He said the law would protect our future, and he was right." Harrison stood up, walking to the window to look down at the Phoenix streets. "These Bitterroot records are being authenticated under federal authority this instant. Silas Vane will never lay eyes on that silver, and he'll answer for every one of his crimes in this very court. As for Mr. Elias, last." Right then, the office door swung wide. A man walked in, his left arm wrapped in white bandages, and his face battered, but his stride was steady and his gray eyes were still burning with life. "Elias," the children cheered, Henry rushing to hug the old cowboy's leg. Elias Thorne stood there, exhausted, but a real deal smile broke across his face. "Told you I wouldn't keep you waiting too long." He turned to Judge Harrison and tipped his hat. "Your Honor, I'm Elias Thorne. I'm here for the final step of the will, filing for formal guardianship of the 5 Montgomery children." The room fell into a heavy, respectful silence. Judge Harrison looked at Elias, then at Caleb. He picked up a quill, dipped it in ink, and signed the federal protection and guardianship papers with a flourish. "Thorne, you're a hell of a veteran, but today Caleb's the hero," Harrison smiled. "Guardianship is granted, and the Bitterroot land is henceforth the impenetrable home of the Montgomery family, under the protection of Elias Thorne." Stepping out of the courthouse, Phoenix was lit up. The gas lamps cast a glow on the faces of 6 people who had walked through the valley of death to find a light. Caleb looked up at the stars, whispering to his parents' spirits that they were safe. "Uncle Elias," Caleb said as they walked toward the hotel, "I finished that law book you gave me." "Good." Elias placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because once that Bitterroot silver starts moving, we're gonna need the best lawyer in Arizona. Someone who knows the law ain't about the color of a man's skin, but the honest-to-God truth in his heart." Elias Thorne led the children down the central avenue, his gait still favoring his unhealed wound, but his back was straight and his hand never left Caleb's shoulder. They weren't a pack of ragged runaways anymore. Under the light of federal justice, they were folks who had reclaimed their honor. "We're putting up at the Grand Arizona tonight," Elias said, his voice low and warm, though still carrying the bone weariness of the fight. "Tomorrow, we've got a different kind of journey to start." "We ain't going back to Ridge Canyon, Uncle?" James asked, his hand still white-knuckled on Elias's duster, as if he was scared the man might vanish into the shadows like a dream. Elias stopped, looking at James's soot-stained face, then over at Caleb. "Ridge Canyon was where I went to hide from the world. But Bitterroot is where your father wanted you to build your own. That's home." Inside the posh hotel lobby, the sight of a trail-worn cowboy and 5 black children made the suit-and-tie fellas and the lace-clad ladies stop and stare. There were curious looks and some prejudiced scowls, but when Elias slapped that federal protection order with its gleaming gold eagle seal onto the front desk, the whispering died out cold. The clerk gave a respectful nod and handed over the keys like they were the biggest bankers in the territory. That night, for the first time in weeks, Caleb laid down on a real bed with linen sheets that smelled like lavender. But sleep wouldn't come. He sat by the window watching the city settle into a hush. The notebook filled with Vane's crimes sat quiet on the table, its job as a witness done. He flipped to the last pages, where he'd scratched down his father's final word. "Caleb, justice ain't something folks just hand out to you. It's something you gotta reach out and grab with the truth and a whole lot of nerve." He let out a small smile. Pa was right, and Elias Thorne was right too. The next morning, as the sun peeked over the peaks surrounding Phoenix, a brand new wagon sturdier than the last and bought with Elias's final bit of savings sat ready out front. They headed north, but this time the destination wasn't Dust Creek. It was the Bitterroot Valley. The trip back didn't taste like death anymore. Instead, it was filled with talk of the future. Elias started teaching Caleb and James how to run a spread and how to read the geological charts Judge Harrison had explained to him. That Bitterroot vein runs deep, Elias explained as they camped by a creek on the second night. It's going to take machinery and some serious backing. But more than that, it needs owners with a cool head and a warm heart. Silas Vane struck out because he only saw the silver. He didn't see the people. As they crossed into Bitterroot territory, the first thing they saw were plumes of white smoke from new houses being framed up. Word of the federal ruling had spread like a wildfire. The Montgomerys' old neighbors folks, who'd kept their heads down under Vane's thumb, were starting to drift back, but there was one lone figure waiting for them right at the border of Lot 42. It was Miller. The bounty hunter didn't have a rifle in his hands. His ankle was wrapped in thick bandages, and he leaned heavy on a crutch. Miller stood there, his scarred face looking gray in the afternoon sun. Elias pulled the wagon to a halt, his hand instinctively dropping to his side. "I ain't here to scrap Thorn," Miller said, his voice raspy and stripped of its fight. Vane was sentenced to hang this morning in Dust Creek. Grady spilled his guts on every job they ran. I just came to give this back. He held out a small wooden box. Caleb climbed down, approaching with caution. Inside was his father's silver pocket watch, the very thing Miller had lifted from Silas Montgomery's body on that fateful night. "I've done a lot of low-down things in my time," Miller said, looking at the dirt, unable to catch Caleb's eye. But seeing a 14-year-old kid use the law to dismantle the slickest shyster in the West, I knew I'd lost something bigger than a gunfight. "Keep it. It belongs to your pa." Miller turned away, limping off toward the trail. Elias didn't draw his iron. He just watched the bounty hunter's shadow fade into the dust. Sometimes the hardest rope to hang by isn't hempits, having to live with the shattering of everything you believed in. "Uncle Elias," Caleb whispered, pressing the watch to his chest, feeling the cold metal start to warm from his own skin. "Should we go after him?" "The law took care of Vane," Elias said thoughtfully. "As for Miller, he handed down his own sentence the second he walked back here. Let him go. We got more important work to do." They drove onto the main Bitterroot spread. The builders Judge Harrison had recommended had already started clearing the rubble. A new, sturdier foundation made of quartz rock was taking shape. The months that followed were an epic of hard labor. Elias Thorne became a father, a teacher, and a protector, stern but full of love. He taught James how to break the wild Arizona mustangs, and showed Sarah and Ruth how to keep the ranch's books. Henry, the youngest, followed Elias like a shadow, learning to read the signs of the land. As for Caleb, he spent most of his evenings by the oil lamp with stacks of thick law books that Judge Miller from Dust Creek would send over from time to time. He didn't just want to protect the silver. He wanted to master that language of truth that had saved his family's hide. One October afternoon, when the Bitterroot mine officially pulled its first load, they threw a small shindig on the grass in front of the new house. Federal Judge Harrison and Judge Miller were both there. In the middle of the party, Elias Thorne stood up, raising a glass of cider. He looked around the circle of family 5 black children, laughing, radiant, and full of life. He looked down at his own hands. The calluses from a life of gunplay had softened from a life of building. "Last year when you kids knocked on my door," Elias said, his voice cracking just a bit with emotion, "I thought I was the one saving your lives. But standing here today, I see it was you who saved mine. You pulled me out of the dark hole of solitude and taught me that justice is worthless if you don't have a shred of common decency." Caleb stood up, stepping beside Elias. He was taller now, with the broad shoulders of a young man coming into his own. "Uncle Elias, my pa said you were the most trustworthy man around," Caleb said, his voice ringing out in front of the judges and the townspeople. "But you're more than that. You're living proof that the law ain't just ink on a dead piece of paper. It's in the way we choose to treat each other when nobody's looking." He pulled out a new sheet of paper, stamped by the Territorial Records Office. "Today, as the primary heir of the Montgomery family, I want to announce a decision. Half of the shares in the Bitterroot mine are going into an educational fund for orphans, and black children in Arizona. We got our justice, and we're going to make sure no other kid has to walk 14 miles through the desert just to find an open door." A roar of applause swept through the Bitterroot Valley, drowning out the wind whistling through the Red Rock canyons. Judge Harrison smiled, clinking glasses with Elias. Karma had come full circle. Those who used the law for evil were gone, and those who honored it with their hearts had found their kingdom. That night, after everyone had cleared out, Elias and Caleb sat together on the porch steps of the new house. The Arizona desert stretched out before them, harsh and mysterious, but it didn't feel scary anymore. "You really set on being a lawyer, Caleb?" Elias asked, his eyes on the distant stars. "Yes, sir," Caleb answered firm. "I want to stand in those fancy offices in Phoenix or Washington, not to make silver, but to make sure every time an orphan knocks on a door, they get a fair shake." Elias clapped his hand on the shoulder of the student and son he was proudest of. "Then let's get a move on tomorrow. It's a long road to Phoenix, but I'll be riding right alongside you." Under the silver moonlight, the shadows of the old cowboy and the young black man merged into the red earth. The story of the Montgomery siblings and a lost thorn wasn't just a legend of the West. It became a hymn to the power of truth, the ultimate moral code, and a simple fact: when love leads the way and the law guards the gate,